This is the Made for Living Well podcast, hosted by Alexa Sherm, the place to create a life well lived.
Welcome back to the podcast. As always, my name's Alexa, and I am so grateful you are here. And the reason I'm grateful you are here is because that means you are on a mission to break up with the common thought process on health and live differently. And truth be told, my entire passion and mission with this podcast is to help show you that health is not outside of you, but it's in you. You have the resources available at no cost to live well. And I want to teach you how to live that out. Because health is more of an action. It's a verb, not a noun. And that means kind of breaking down what we've thought about health so we can create a new vision and actually learn to live it. Now, that is my passion at all the places you can find me, at The Living Well, Made for Living Well, and of course, my weekly newsletter, The Weekly Fill. I love communicating to you in all of those places, but I especially have been loving my newsletter. Now, I know there are 1,000,001 newsletters you could be a part of, so just let me inform you of why you should be a part of The Weekly Fill. One, because there's a free version of it, which has great information on a range of topics from the practical to the philosophical, all the topics of health and confusion, and really breaking up with bad diet advice. Now, I just did an entire free series called Bad Diet Advice that you can find at The Weekly Fill, and I'll make sure and link those up below. Those are some of my favorite articles that I've ever written, and I think that they've provided a powerful shift in many of you, as I've heard back from you. Now, as a part of the Weekly Fill, you can also pay for a subscription, which is $5 a month, less than a cup of coffee at your local coffee shop. And inside that, you get free articles, additional topics, podcasts, and of course, the live monthly class. Now, I know everyone kind of talks about what is the live monthly class and what do you do inside of it. I wanted to give you a little glimpse of what happens inside a live class. Although you can't necessarily see the faces inside the podcast, of course, or necessarily hear other people talking, that's all part of the live class. But I did want to give you a taste of the content you could learn. Now, we've been talking about sugar here, and I wanted to continue that conversation by talking about the ins and outs of artificial sweetener and everything you need to know. So hopefully this preview of the live class clears the air on artificial sweeteners and also gives you a glimpse of why you should subscribe to the Weekly Fill, whether in the free version or to become a subscriber where you get these live monthly classes. I would love to have you there, and I think that you'll learn so much, especially as we move into a new year and work through the health snowball together. So you can find all the information on today's podcast wherever you're listening to the podcast. Below in the description, I have a link to The Living Well to get more information on today's podcast, but also the Weekly Fill, where you can sign up to be a subscriber or a paid subscriber and join us for the next live class, which is coming up in a few weeks. Again, all that information is below, but for now, let's get right into this live class all about artificial sweeteners. I hope you enjoy. Okay, so I'm just going to get started. Again, ask questions in the chat. I'll open it up that we can just have a conversation here once I get some of this information out. But I did want to forward stack some of the information so you can have time to process it, maybe write some things down, and we can have an open conversation about it. And here's the reality when it comes to health and nutrition. We are still learning so much. And honestly, I don't think we'll ever know how detailed and intricate and really amazing the human body is. But there are some things that we can know in general. And one of those things that we found over and over again is that anytime we process or we manipulate a substance, hoping that it reacts better inside of our body, it rarely does. Like usually, most of the time, the source closest to nature is always going to be the best source for us. And those sources drastically change what our body does with it. And I think when it comes to sugar, we really lump so much into one very broad category when there's a lot of specifics and nuances within that add a bit more complexity. Like sugar isn't sugar. And artificial sweeteners are not a replacement for sugar either. They're all very different compounds and substances and chemicals, and your body does something very different with all of them. As if you've listened to the podcast on sugar, and the last few emails that I wrote, I am a really big, and I really did struggle with putting that out there because I didn't want people to hear me say all sugar is fair game. And I think that's often what happens when I'm kind of trying to pull back from the extreme of eliminate sugar, restrict it, deprive yourself of it, to get you to see that you actually have a need for sugar inside your body. And not all sugar reacts the same way. And in the email I just sent out today, it was talking about some research studies about diabetes and how they found that honey loading or glucose loading on the body actually can help make people more insulin sensitive, which really throws a wrench into this concept that all sugar is dysregulating your metabolism. And we see over and over that that's not true. What's confusing is there's studies and research on both sides, so it feels really conflicting. But I think really when we get into the root of it, it's sugar and nature and a nutrified body can really process that well and utilize it in a really healthy and beneficial way. When we're living in dysfunction and we're consuming processed sugars or more of these non-nutritive sugars, which is what so many of the sugars that we're consuming in processed foods and processed sugars are really doing more harm than they are good. But it's also a whole lifestyle component. Now, when we talk about artificial sweeteners, I think it's a really fascinating subject, and I think the food industry has had a heyday with them. The thing about artificial sweeteners, and I think why they're so popular and why there's so much noise of people using them in the diet space, is because they're really cheap. They are, on average, a fraction of the cost of actual sugar to use in a product. Like, I think a bottle of Coke, they average, and this might not be fully accurate, but it was something like a bottle of Coke with regular sugar was about 5 cents, and 5 or 6 cents to just in the cost of sugar. And then in artificial forms, it was 3 cents, or, it was basically half of that. And over the course of millions and millions of bottles of that adds up really quickly, right? And so there is a push in our world to use these artificial sweeteners, these processed foods, because if they're man-made, there's not a lot of process in growing them and harvesting them and all the things that it would take to use an actual real sugar. So there is a big difference and there is a big push for them. Now, there is also a lot of concerns regarding artificial sweeteners. And again, this goes on both sides. And so I want to come on common ground and start to see it in a bigger view, because not all artificial sweeteners are considered the same either. But I think it's really interesting to understand the history of it. Like I mentioned, the food industry really picked up on the use of artificial sweeteners right after World War II, as diabetes kind of started making itself more prevalent. And they found that artificial sweeteners, or they marketed to those people who had sugar problems or problems with sugar. So they started marketing it to those people with metabolic dysfunction, which couldn't have been nearly as many as it is today. But they started to use it in that way to promote, like, you can drink this product even if you struggle with sugar or you have concerns about sugar. What they quickly realized was that as the diet space was starting to kick off and starting to get into this thin world where we all wanted to lose weight and measuring our health by caloric equations, they realized that if they could get people to cut out sugar and start to eat some of these or consume some of these non-nutritive foods, which essentially means it doesn't offer anything to the body, it has basically no caloric energy in it, most of them also don't have any nutrients in them, then they could, market it to those people who wanted to lose weight. And I think that's how, a lot of products quickly picked up this notion of these are diet foods, or these are 0-calorie foods, or these are 0-sugar foods. Like, those words became really attractive to us because we had learned at the time that reducing your caloric intake or reducing your sugar or calories was the best option for your health. Now, of course, before that, it was actually developed by some chemists who accidentally figured out that they had made a sweetener or a substance that was sweet, and then they went on to test it to see if it was usable or digestible or safe for human consumption. And what they were actually working on was something that had to do with coal tar. And the chemist came home, and I think the story is so funny because it's such a chemist thing to do, came home or went to lunch and essentially ate a piece of bread and it tasted sweet. And then they wiped their face with their napkin, and that also had sweetness on it. And they started to recognize that maybe they brought something home from the lab that acted as a sugar. And so they went back, and that's how saccharin was actually developed by some chemists who were working on something to do with coal tar. They created saccharin. And I think it's a wild story because, one, you would think chemists would wash their hands. But also, just we weren't really looking for it, but we found it. And then it quickly became, again, picked up by the diet space, by food industry, that was marketed to get you to buy their products. Now, of course, with that being said, I think living in a world that has massive amounts of metabolic dysfunction, it is fair to say that we do have a need to understand how can we reduce our load of unhealthy or unnecessary processed extra carbs, sugar, whatever it is. Like, we are over consuming a lot of things that are really dysregulating our metabolism. And we are living in an age, in a world where we are products of metabolic dysfunction, living with disease that is completely preventable on the metabolic side. Now, unfortunately, this doesn't always come easy. And that's because a lot of these food products and these, even like things like sugar and carbs, can have an addictive or a pleasurable effect of that. But when it comes to artificial sweeteners, I think that they actually accentuated the addiction to sugar more so than even sugar itself. And the reason that I say that is because something that is really interesting about artificial sweeteners and the human body is that the body perceives something before it actually makes it a reality, or it understands it as reality. And what I mean by that is, at the sight of food, your body is already perceiving what it thinks it needs in order to digest and metabolize that food, in order to use it. That's why at the sight of food or at the thought of food, you can start salivating. Your perception about what you're going to consume actually has a lot to do with how your body breaks it down. Like, your body starts to prepare itself long before you even put food on your tongue. Now, after you start perceiving food, as soon as it hits your tongue, your taste buds have receptors for all different forms of flavors and substances. I don't want to say just sugars, but it does have sugar receptors, or what's considered sweet receptors. It's not necessarily a sugar receptor, but it's pulling in the flavor of sweetness. And that is going to then continue to alter what hormones, what enzymes, what molecules are released in order to properly deal with the food that you're consuming. The same is true for all of the senses that we have in our tongue, or the taste that we have in our tongue. They actually are all releasing different chemicals in our body, which I think is really fascinating. But when it comes to our actual ability to taste, it's not necessarily picking up the sugar molecule, it's picking up the taste of sugar. And this is kind of hard to conceptualize. They have similar molecular structures, but again, it's not necessarily determining like, okay, this tastes sweet, but there's no sugar in it. So what happens when you consume a non-nutritive or sugar that doesn't actually have any sugar in it? And by that, I mean glucose, sucrose, fructose. Like, there's nothing that actually needs like something like insulin in order to absorb in your body. It really starts to trick your body in a way. It actually starts to kind of mess with the body's processes. And it does throw off your biochemistry. It throws off your entire hormonal flow, and in the end can actually lead to excess stress. And why that happens is because when you consume something that your body perceives as sweet, it starts releasing insulin and the impact of that sweetness on your tongue. Some people would even argue, and some research would indicate, that it happens at the sight of food. Like, we have started to create perceptions about what foods are sweet, and at the sight of food, we can actually start to release insulin in preparation for the load of glucose that's about to come in. Now, of course, it doesn't release a ton of glucose or insulin right away, but it slowly starts to release it at the process or at the site or even the taste of sugar. And when you consume something that doesn't have sugar, insulin no longer has a job to do. And there are some people that think this is a really good thing. I think we've learned that as long as you don't have sugar, it doesn't really matter. The problem is that insulin needs a job to do. Like, it doesn't just get reabsorbed into the body without completing a job. Your body doesn't like extra things floating around in the bloodstream. So when you don't have the sugar to take in your body and that insulin doesn't have a job to do, there's no sugar to take to the cells, what happens then is your body starts to break down some of its own glycogen stores or glucose stores or stores inside your muscle or other bodily cells in order to produce enough glucose to get rid of the insulin. So we actually can see a spike in insulin even in the absence of glucose simply because of the perception of eating something sweet, but not actually dealing with it. And I think this is one of the leading reasons why the research shows that artificial sweeteners are linked to weight gain. And it's partially because of this mechanism that's happening inside the body. Like, insulin is high, and in order to deal with that, then your body has to go through a process of breaking down its own body in order to produce the glucose that then it needs to put into cells to get rid of the insulin. Terry, if you are feeling this, give me a thumbs up. Or if you have any questions about this, let me know. But that is like one of the biggest functions I think that we need to be cautious of when it comes to artificial sweeteners. Now, of course, there's a ton of other research out there that says things like artificial sweeteners, and one of the most studied aspects of artificial sweeteners right now is the effect of artificial sweeteners on your gut microbiome. And I think this is a really important thing to know, especially in the field of just sugar in general, that when you consume food, you're not just feeding your body, but you're feeding the host of bacteria on your body that is working in conjunction with the cells of your body in order to create health. Like, we are not acting alone, but we're acting in relationship with this bacteria in and on our body. And that bacteria also needs to be fed, and it needs to be fed well in order to sustain its microbiome or in order to sustain its environment. And that gut microbiome often does need or require some level of sugar in order to maintain it. It is also fuel for your bacteria. Now, there are people who are like, but that can lead to candida and the overgrowth of bacteria. And yes, there is some scope of that, but candida is more a lack of balance in your microbiome. It's an overgrowth in some way, but it's really an imbalance. Like, there's other bacteria that have maybe died or not being fed what it needs. Like, your microbiome needs more than just glucose in order to survive. And there are things that can kill it. But one thing that it does need is the sugar in that. And that sugar actually helps specific sugars, not all sugars. Some sugars really mess up the microbiome, especially artificial sweeteners. And there's a lot of research coming out about this, that how it really destroys and wrecks the microbiome of your gut. And that changes what your body can take in and how it metabolizes and uses the nutrients that you're consuming. Your gut microbiome is a really big deal. It's got a first line of connection to your brain, which I think is also why some artificial sweetener studies show that it can cause brain fog or cognitive function decline. Obviously, so can excess sugar. So I want to be clear and say, like, I think we're living on the extremes. Like, the goal is not too much just natural sugar or just sugar in general, but it's also not too many artificial sweeteners and not enough sugar. I hate throwing just food substances under the bus and making us worry about things that just overwhelm us. But I do think it's really clear in the research and what we know about artificial sweeteners on the body that there's not a lot of nutrient or benefits to your biology by consuming artificial sweeteners, and many of them actually cause great harm to your body. And I think, again, anytime we use something artificial, that is going to cause a host of problems. So again, artificial sweeteners are kind of creating this confusion in the scientific world, it's called like uncoupling. It's where your body thinks that as long as there's sugar, your body needs insulin. That's a coupling effect where those two go hand in hand. They work well together. Uncoupling happens when you have one, but you don't have the other. It's like you've missed the relationship, you don't have them working together, and they don't work well alone. And so the uncoupling effect really leads to bodily compensation. And I think that's where we enter into these host of problems that are associated with excess artificial sweetener intake. So questions, I'm going to just slow down for a minute because this is like drinking from a fire hose. And let me know if you have any questions so far. Okay, I don't see any coming in. So we're going to keep going. So again, one big point of artificial sweeteners is the body trickery. It's creating an uncoupling effect, just leading to the body to compensate in unhealthy ways. The other reason artificial sweeteners are harming our body is because it's interfering and maybe influencing our gut bacteria in unhealthy ways. It's not giving it what it needs to thrive, and it's causing this imbalance in our microbiome and really the environment that it needs to thrive. I think a third thing that is important to note is that there is an addictive value, maybe even more so for artificial sweeteners than sugar. And the reason for that, and the reason for that is that artificial sweeteners are considered non-nutritive, not because there's not actually nutrients within them or calories within them, but you use such a microscopic amount compared to traditional sugar that most of them can be labeled as 0 calorie, like as non-nutritive. And the reason that we use such a small amount is because most of these artificial sweeteners are thousands of times sweeter. Some of them are hundreds of times sweeter, but there's some that are thousands of times sweeter than regular sugar. So how it interferes with your taste buds is actually significantly different than regular sugar. There's a maximum amount of sweetness to that. And if you're a diet pop drinker and you've ever had a sip of regular pop, then you know, like, okay, sometimes I feel like regular sugar tastes a little bit more bitter. And what's interesting about that is there are some specific sugars and artificial sweeteners that act on numerous taste sensations. Like some of them are acting not only on your sweet receptors, but also your bitter receptors. And so I don't want to say that they're causing bitterness, but they're actually influencing the way that you taste other things or consider what you consider bitter in other foods. But regardless, because of the level of sweetness in these artificial sweeteners, it really does make you, or it sets that as the standard for what you consider sweet. So again, when you go back to natural sugars, they just don't hit the same level or the same pleasure points as artificial sweeteners because the threshold of sweetness of those things is far less than the artificial sweeteners. So it does kind of set this unrealistic bar that you can't find in any other natural food but the artificial source. And so because of that, it starts to lead to this addictive property. Because sweetness actually acts on your dopamine response. It actually acts on these excitatory processes inside your brain that make you want it. Like there's no level of any human that doesn't at some point crave something sweet. Like that is a part of human nature. It's a part of how we're wired. And it's not wrong, it's natural. Now, of course, we can control that, but sometimes it gets out of control when we're constantly kind of triggering it or firing it with these artificial sources that are immensely more sweet than regular sugar. And what's interesting about non-nutritive sweeteners or sweeteners that don't have any actual sugar or nutritive value in them is that when you consume food, you're not only hitting on the pleasure response, but you're actually kind of rebalancing that dopamine hit with satiety. Like the pleasure equals itself out or becomes more sustained, not just because you hit this high, but satiety comes in based on the caloric response and things like leptin that are released after you consume food. Even like the most popular GLP-1 that's released from your gut bacteria when you consume food, that helps to provide a level of satiety inside your body. And the dopamine hit plus satiety is really where I think most people want to experience when they consume food. Like you want to enjoy it, but you also want to be satisfied from it. And that satisfaction should last a decent amount of time. However, when you eat something that doesn't have the nutritive value in it, you're not really releasing the satiety hormones that you need in order to level out the excitatory response. So you have this big spike because you ate something super sweet, but because there was no satiety to it, there's nothing that holds you over. It's kind of like an empty feeling. It's like not enough. And when you feel like it's not enough, then you just need another hit, like that quick hit. And as soon as you spike it, it's going to fall unless you can get something to even that out. And so when we look at artificial sweeteners, we do know that there's an addictive property to it, that it significantly changes and alters the way that you experience taste. And it significantly decreases your satiety, which means you're going to need it more and more and more, even more so than actual sugar. And if you consume actual sugar, it's not going to be enough because, again, you've set a threshold with your taste buds of what is considered sweet. And it has to hit that threshold in order for you to feel good or excited about it, to hit that pleasure response. And really, when most people go to sugar, they're looking for a level of pleasure or comfort. Now, the good news in that is that your taste buds are actually always kind of evolving and changing. And what I mean by that, they're always taste buds regenerate really quickly. So taste buds, all of them on average, it only takes 1 to 2 weeks to regenerate those. And so that really proves that it takes only 1 to 2 weeks to really alter those taste buds again. Like it's not a long process of shifting your taste buds to recalibrate to natural sweetness. It is work. It's not necessarily going to be easy, but it can happen, and it can happen relatively quickly. But the way to do that, of course, is to cut back or reduce or eliminate those super high spikes of artificial sweeteners, to bring that back into a normal threshold where you can feel satisfied and pleasured off of life's more natural sugars, the ones that your body is actually using in positive ways, the ones that are attached with nutrients that drastically change your biological response, that don't create the same health detriments that the artificial sweeteners do. So I think in this topic, that's like the third biggest, is that the third or the fourth? I'm not sure. But the third biggest thing that I could bring up about artificial sweeteners. I mean, we could get into how some link it to cancer. I mean, the FDA came out with that big announcement that sucralose was linked to cancer. Honestly, there's multiple of the artificial sweeteners that throughout history have come off the market and then went back on the market with thoughts that they were cancer causing or carcinogens. I think on some level, again, yes, all of these could be considered carcinogens, just simply how it acts on your metabolism and how it creates metabolic dysfunction. Now, I also want to mention that there are more artificial sweeteners than just the non-nutritive ones. Like there are 6 FDA-approved non-nutritive sweeteners, artificial sweeteners on the market, like saccharin, aspartame, sucralose. There's a few other ones like acesulfame, potassium, neotame. Those are all FDA approved. And honestly, obviously, some of these you might not have ever heard of. Sucralose is one of the most popular. It's found in over 6,000 products in the grocery store. I mean, it's used in massive amounts. It's also the one that has the most recent claim that it's a carcinogen or cancer causing. But again, I would go as far, and there's even research to state that there are sugars that have nutrients in them, glucose, fructose, sucrose, whatever it is, that are also artificial in nature as well. Like they're man-made, right? They're not as pure and wholesome as maple syrup or honey or even something like sorghum. And that would be considered like high fructose corn syrup is technically considered an artificial sugar. It's been altered to the point to become an artificial sweetener. Now, what about stevia, monk fruit, sugar alcohols? Those aren't necessarily considered artificial because they're found more in nature. I don't like sugar alcohols at all. Most of them, or many of them, actually convert into fructose and act similar to high fructose corn syrup. But stevia, monk fruits, allulose, those things are found in nature, and so they're considered more natural or non-nutritive natural sweeteners. But many of them actually also still contain a nutritive value to them. However, again, we have to remember if they're 0 calorie and they taste sweet, that is still creating the uncoupling effect inside the body. So while they're probably better for you, I would still caution to be careful about how much you consume of them because it still is creating an uncoupling effect between the use of glucose and insulin, and it's causing a dysregulation in your taste buds. Allulose is probably the most promising of creating actual benefits from it. But again, I think all of these are processed very differently than just natural sugars. And because of that, even if the response looks similar, they're definitely having different long-term consequences based, again, on how your body is going to use them. And when it comes to artificial sweeteners versus something like natural sugar, most artificial sweeteners are broken down and metabolized in the liver, just like high fructose corn syrup. That's all processed through the liver, where more of your natural sugars are going to be processed in your bloodstream. So definitely a difference there. Because when you start pumping too much stuff through your liver or attempting to, you can slow down those pathways and create more sluggishness. And I think the use of high fructose corn syrup is why we have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Because that fat, it's converting that sugar into fat. It has nowhere to go, so it just keeps packing on around your liver. So those are some of the big things. Now, again, I want to clear the air here. I'm not a fan of most artificial sweeteners. I think over the course of life, the best option for your body is the source closest to the earth. So I'm going to go out and say, I think sugar is great in the natural form. I think fruits are fantastic for our body. I think starchy vegetables, whole grains. I think maple syrup and honey. I mean, honey has numerous enzymatic properties. It has very many medicinal benefits to it. Even arguably maple syrup. Like, these are not just sugar. They have enzymes and nutrients within them that give them added benefit. I would even say that if you want to get into other sugars, like more granular sugars, coconut sugar can be a great option. I like sorghum, sometimes molasses. Like, these are more of your natural sugars. I even would say that in moderation, cane sugar or an organic cane sugar is definitely going to be better any day than a sucralose, an aspartame, a high fructose corn syrup. Those are the things we really want to see you leave, because regardless of how many calories or if they have calories, they're still being processed in a way that's increasing weight gain, increasing cancer risk, increasing cardiovascular risk, decreasing detoxification, harming your kidneys, as again, another detox tool. I mean, there's a lot of research that shows some negative side effects to those things. And when it comes to things like stevia and monk fruit and allulose, I think, again, just to caution, the overconsumption could lead to the breakdown of your body because it's still releasing an insulin response, and insulin without glucose is kind of a lost duck, right? Like, it can't do anything. And so your body in some capacity has to break this down. And I had a really interesting rundown with this with one of my kiddos when she was in preschool, and I will link it up in the blog post that I'm going to share about this. But I was giving her a drink that had a lot of stevia in it and a drink mix because, most healthy drink mixes, protein bars, protein powders have some level of stevia in them. Almost all of them. Some of them are using monk fruit, but not all of them. And again, over-consuming, I found that she was so fatigued, so much muscle weakness. She actually started to kind of limp on her legs. And I actually got really worried about her. Like, something is really wrong. And that is when my mom actually alerted to me. She's like, hey, what's in that drink mix? You think there's something in there that could be hurting her? And that's when I started to do a deep dive into stevia and found that the overconsumption in the wrong forms is really causing a lot of harm and degrading of your body and your tissues. And so I think it's good to caution that while better options for sure, over consuming them is still creating an imbalance and a dysregulation in your body and your metabolism. And that is always going to cause problems. And so if I had to choose, I would always go to the natural forms. When I bake, when I cook, it's always honey, maple syrup, coconut sugar, organic cane sugar. In times, that's what I'm going to. We use a lot of fruits, a lot of fruit purees. And also what's really fascinating, and when I give you the healthy sugar guide, you can alter flavors by using spices. Like the more spices you use, the less sweeteners you need. And so a lot of the times when we're baking, we're using cinnamon and nutmeg and these spicy, like we try to make a lot of spicy desserts because you get the flavor and the sweetness, but without it needing to be overly sweet. So increasing some of those flavorings, but those are like my main go-tos. If I went for a non-nutritive sweetener, it would probably be something along the lines of a monk fruit or stevia. And here's the reality. There's no escaping it. It's in so many things. And I think we don't even realize, especially if we're living healthy, how many things it is in, even stevia. And so every day I'm probably getting some level of stevia in something that I'm consuming. Ideally, I would cut back on that. But in general, I am trying to be cautious about how much I consume. It's not a free-for-all, in my opinion. It's a once in a while if I need a protein powder, and I'm not just using collagen or, an occasional drink or something like that, I might choose the stevia form. I think all in all, it's just a picture that paints. I don't think it's necessarily about replacing one with the other than just replacing it all with natural sugars. But like if you look at pop consumption, I can't say artificial sweetened beverages are better than sugar sweetened beverages because honestly, they both react in similar ways or they both have similar outcomes that are both kind of unhealthy. So the goal is not to be like, okay, I'm not going to drink Diet Pop or I'm going to drink Diet Pop. It's to say like, maybe we should just work on consuming less of that altogether and increase our usage of more of those natural sugars. I know that's not like what anyone wants to hear, especially those people, the Diet Pop people, they just love it. And I hate talking about food restriction, but I do think it's really important to understand that food isn't necessarily good or bad, but there are food substances, which is different than food found in nature, food substances or man-made created products that are probably not doing a lot of great things for our body, that are causing our body to work harder than they should. When our body works harder than it should, it has to compensate. It doesn't want to, but it starts to go into survival mode. And survival mode often is the storage of extra body fat. It's the breakdown of hormonal flow. It's the dysregulation of your nervous system. There's so many things that happen that is necessary for survival. But in our day-to-day life, that should not be our case. That should not be our norm. And it's become that because of these unhealthy patterns. So I hope that answers your question. Again, I'm a fan of sugar eaten in the right context. I'm not a fan of artificial sweeteners. And honestly, this is a big topic and there's many more points. I had like 6 pages of notes that we could have gotten into the nitty-gritty of it. We didn't talk about how these can be stored inside the body when your body can't break them down, all those things. But I promised to be timely on this because we all have a limited amount of time and I want to use that well. So what questions do you have, if any, that I could answer for you? And you can unmute yourself or I can unmute you too if you want to ask them live. And I'm going to pull up the few questions that I have while you're adding any questions that you have. Okay, so a question that I got, can artificial sweeteners help with weight loss or do they actually make people gain weight? And I think it was a good idea or good understanding. And I kind of talked about this initially in the the lesson. But obviously the understanding was that if we could cut back on calories and still have the flavor benefits of sugar, that felt like a win-win, right? Like that felt like it should help people lose weight. Now, historically, obviously, if we look back in time, we can see that the consumption of artificial sweeteners has not really helped anyone lose weight. Obviously, if you went from drinking extra pop and sugar to artificial sweeteners, you might have seen an initial decline in weight just simply by not consuming that or decreasing that initial caloric load. But the problem is over time, it's kind of like a cross chart, right? Where you might have an initial decline in weight because you have a decrease in caloric intake. But over time, what happens is artificial sweeteners, again, generally increase your cravings and your need because they reduce your satiety. So most people actually end up eating more food. As research shows, those people who don't consume or consume artificial sweeteners generally consume more calories over the course of a day than someone who doesn't. And I think this comes back to, again, the satiety metric, that non-nutritive sweeteners or zero-calorie sweeteners are not inducing a satiety response. And we need to be satisfied. That's part of our biology. It's part of our safety response. When your body feels like it doesn't have what it needs or it's not satisfied, there's a little bit of a stress response or a threat involved in that, and that can lead to more stress. So no, it's not going to help you lose weight. Unfortunately, and in time, it can actually cause an increase in body weight. So there is some linkage of artificial sweetener use and obesity. Although that research is really disputed, and it's really hard to get into that mix because if you start looking at the research, you really have to look at who's funding the research because there's research on all sides, and sometimes there's big companies that are paying for research to go in their favor. Another one is, which artificial sweetener is the healthiest? If I had to pick, again, it would definitely be considered more like the stevia or monk fruit. Those would be the options that I would consider the closest to natural, but I also still think that your body still senses sweetness and it has to do something with that. So I'd still caution you, but if I had to choose, those would be the better ones. Now, there are more processed forms of stevia, and I think those are the forms that we need to be more careful with. So if you're eating or consuming a drink that comes from an overly processed food, you're going to get an overly processed form of stevia, which is not beneficial to the body, which actually has more chemicals on it that can decrease or force your liver to work a little bit harder. And process those chemicals. And that is not necessarily work that we want to put on our body. Some of them are considered more toxic in nature. So I think we have to be careful that not all artificial sweeteners, even stevia and monk fruit, are created equal. So we do have to be cautious about what forms we're consuming. Now, I'm a big believer that there's a level of resiliency that one meal, one drink, once in a while is not really going to make or break you. It's what we do consistently day to day to day. So on Thanksgiving, if you have all the desserts, it's not the end of the world. If you go to a movie theater and you're like, I gave up Diet Pop, but I really want a Diet Pop, it's not going to make or break you, right? It's not those things. It's the consistency nature of it. It's what your body has to do and what it has available and to work with that really is changing the entire chemical structure and creating the outcomes that you experience. So what's the difference between a natural and an artificial sugar? Again, the real big difference between them is how close to nature are they versus are they chemically synthesized? And artificial sweeteners are often chemically processed or even made, not grown. And so that's even like high fructose corn syrup. I live in the middle of Iowa. Of course, I know where high fructose corn syrup lives or grows. It grows in corn. But there is a massive chemical process to create high fructose corn syrup. And so there's a lot more chemicals involved in the making of that. And that's where it turns into an artificial source. The same thing with like sucralose, aspartame. They're chemically created in a way. So that's kind of the big difference. Any questions on the chat? I think the last one that I got here, just making sure there's what are your thoughts on maltodextrin? This is a good question. Again, I think that all of these sugars, right, that we consume are always getting broken down into other compounds. Like when we look at sugar, right, when you eat something like a piece of fruit, it's not necessarily, that's not just usable sugar. Your body's breaking that down into fructose, glucose, sucrose, which really sucrose is getting broken down into fructose and glucose. And those then are either glucose is the only usable form of sugar. Fructose is then going to get broken down even further into fatty acids, into glucose, and into lactate. And so fructose is going to get broken down into those compounds. And that's what happens with things like maltodextrin, is it's still a carbohydrate, which means it still contains sugar. So when it comes to maltodextrin, most people aren't consuming it in mass quantities unless you can tell me what product you're using it with or where you're consuming the majority of it. But in general, maltodextrin, like most carbohydrates, is still getting broken down into those sugars, which are getting processed more as the natural forms. But I would say maltodextrin is more of a processed food. It's derived from corn, rice, potatoes, probably mostly corn though, and it's going to react more similar probably to something like a high fructose corn syrup in the body. However, you're probably consuming far less maltodextrin than something like high fructose corn syrup. What are you using it for? I mean, maltodextrin has a pretty high glycemic index, which we didn't really get into on here, but it would spike it quite a bit. It's going to act, like I said, more like a high fructose corn syrup than it is like a honey or maple syrup for sure. Yeah, it's in a lot of products. Tea, I guess I didn't realize it was in tea. I mean, I understood that a lot of people use it as like a thickening agent or filler. Oh, powdered tea sticks. Yeah, so it's often a filler. For sure. So again, it's still going to get processed as a sugar. So it's going to just increase your load of sugar, again, acting more similar to a high fructose corn syrup than a natural sugar, partially because of how it's derived. And I can see, let me see if I can find how much fructose is in maltodextrin. I know it's really high on the glycemic index. Let's see where it stands on the glycemic index. So the glycemic index is like basically the rate or the spike or the available glucose that raises your blood sugar. So the higher the glycemic index number, generally the higher it spikes your blood glucose. And so it has a glycemic index of 85 to 136, which is far higher than regular sugar. Table sugar glycemic index is 65. So, I mean, it's relatively higher than just eating regular sugar. And I think that's what's interesting about a lot of these fillers that we use in food products is that they're worse off than just consuming regular sugar. And I think that's what's so fascinating is like we've kind of villainized sugar, but we've labeled all these other sugars that are worse than sugar itself, all these other fillers, and that people don't even recognize them as a potential spike in their blood sugar, as a potential problem in their consumption. And so I would say if you can find products without it, it would definitely be better. Because again, that is going to raise or spike your blood sugar greater than just regular sugar. Great question. What other questions do you have? Or do you want me to keep going further into that? I think maltodextrin is just really just one of those processed ingredients that is a filler. And so those are things that I would try to, again, you're not going to avoid them completely, just like you're never going to avoid artificial sweeteners completely. But if you are more aware of it, or if you can make it yourself, like maltodextrin is not an ingredient that you're going to buy at the grocery store and use in your products. And so is there something that you can make yourself
that is going to be better. And I would say on average, like even when I did, part of my education was doing food product development, which is really fascinating to understand how food products are actually developed. But on average, most food products contain significantly more sugar and alternative forms, something like maltodextrin, than homemade versions. So I think sometimes people get really scared of using sugar or cooking cookies at home and making their own desserts. But we have to recognize that doing that is actually significantly healthier than popping some candy at your desk or eating something that's considered healthy but highly processed. Like those foods that you can make at home, even if they're considered a dessert, are going to be significantly more satiating and definitely healthier than anything that we're going to buy at the store. Most food products are used, or most of the food product ingredients are actually going to be much higher on the glycemic index than natural sugar or table sugar. And part of the reason is because it hits on a higher pleasure response, right? It's part of the addictive nature. Food companies want you to keep coming back to buy their product. And in order to do that, they have to give it a lot of reasons to hit those dopamine responses, to excite your body, to make it excited about what it's going to do. And the less it can satisfy you from that, the more you're going to eat of it. So food companies do not like to add satiating ingredients to their products. It reduces the amount that you'll consume. They want you to consume more. And it's great marketing, right? Like it's a great business model, but it's not so great on our health. So yes, let me pull up some other names of hidden sugars that I think are really great. And I could add this, I'm going to write this down. That I'll add a list of those things. And again, you're not going to avoid them completely. You're still going to rely on a granola bar. You still might have your tea sticks once in a while, but is there a better option that you could replace it with? I'm going to write that down and I'll create a list of those things. Again, not to scare you, but just that you can be better informed. All right. Do you have any other questions? We're almost at an hour. So I know that this is a lot to process. And I know if you're listening to the replay that you're probably going to have questions. Please leave a comment or send me a private message. I am happy to help you. I hope this wasn't overwhelming. And most importantly, I hope that you know that the restriction elimination and kind of the movement towards more of this artificial side is not doing your body any favor. I think the best case scenario is to make more of these desserts at home and really enjoy them. And also to put more emphasis into the natural carbohydrates, because if you listen to the last podcast, I think it will really explain that those are really helping to create this satiation, the satiety that you're looking for, and also helping your body and your cells to respond and to work in a healthy metabolic balanced state. And that's really what we're looking for. As I mentioned on the podcast, in the new year, we're going to talk about metabolic dysfunction and really metabolism in general and how we can help our body to function better. And this is a slow process. Here's a big point that I want to tell you. If you're a big artificial sweetener person, like that's what you consume, I would love to see you gradually and naturally start to reduce some of those sugars, moving back into the natural sugar side. However, you cannot do this too quickly because it will shock your body. Even if it's healthy, too much of a change too fast is not great for your body. Your body has to learn how to metabolize and use these in healthy ways again. It doesn't just happen. You have learned and taught your body to rely on other forms of glucose. And so just switching and going cold turkey in the other direction is really going to just completely cause havoc inside your body and dysregulation. So if you move to the natural sugar side, don't go binge all of it, right? Like just start slowly. Slowly start making that change. Slowly start adding some more fruit in. Add some honey in. Use maple syrup. Start to make those shifts. Maybe make your own homemade granola bars. I know it's a little bit more work, but you might find like that's really beneficial and nutrient dense and metabolically healthy for your body. So you can't cold turkey it. You can't go all in, but make slow changes. And over time, you should notice changes in your energy level, in your cognitive function, in your metabolism. So many things can change. And most importantly, we have to know that restriction, deprivation, starvation of any form of sugar is really not going to be a lasting and effective way to get your body to respond well to sugar. And I think that's what I love so much about this topic, and what I hope to inform you of is we really want our bodies to respond well. That's the goal. It's not to micromanage what we do, hoping to change our body, but it's how can I support my body so my body responds better, so that it responds in health. And it wants to do that, but it has to have the right fuel, the right ingredients in order to do that. So making these slow changes can really have a significant impact. But just do it slowly. And over time, hopefully you'll start to feel those benefits. So keep me posted with more questions. Thank you so much for being here. I have loved being here. I love these live classes. I know this one kind of came out of the blue, and hopefully we'll have more of a routine going forward and more, or what do I want to say? It's getting late. It's like 12-hour workday, right? What do I want to say? I will get the dates out to you faster so you have more time to prepare. I need to be done talking for the day. Thank you so much for being here. I will get a replay up for you tomorrow so that you can have it, listen to it again, take notes, ask questions. Let's just continue this discussion about sugar and artificial sweetener in the days and weeks ahead. Okay, have a great night.